The men from the search party reached the slope in near silence. The jungle around them was still, broken only by the soft crackle of leaves under boots and the distant call of unseen birds. Ahead, against the green, lay metal that did not belong there. A twin-engined aircraft had come apart among the trees, its frame bent, its surfaces marked and torn, its tail section resting at an angle that told the whole story without a single word spoken aloud. They began with routine work. Secure the area. Note positions. Mark where each fragment had settled. They measured headings, checked altitudes, compared the map in their hands with the landscape in front of them. It should have been a straightforward confirmation, a transport surprised by opposing fighters operating at the fringes of their range. Yet the numbers refused cooperation. From this hillside to the nearest known enemy fighter base was well beyond the comfortable reach they had calculated so many times before. The point of loss lay deep inside a zone that, according to all prior assumptions, should have offered security. To appear here at this time, an interceptor would have needed to cross hundreds of miles of open water, arrive within a narrow slice of the morning, and still retain enough fuel to turn back. It sounded less like an operation and more like a story told after lights out. The officers exchanged brief glances above their notebooks. They did not dramatize what they saw. They simply listed facts: location, direction of approach, traces on the trees, the pattern of damage on the remaining structure. One of them quietly traced a line from this point back across the sea, following the compass. The pencil point reached not a nearby outpost, but Henderson Field on distant Guadalcanal. That line, if real, implied a kind of reach they had not yet attributed to their opponents. Only when personal effects were collected did the weight of the scene fully settle. Among the items carefully recovered and set aside were documents and insignia that confirmed what higher command had feared the moment contact was lost. The occupant of the forward cabin had not been an anonymous passenger. This flight had carried the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the strategist whose name was synonymous with the opening operations of the Pacific conflict, the figurehead whose presence on the front line was meant to steady and inspire. News of such a loss could not be handled carelessly. Official statements would present it with solemn respect, an experienced leader traveling among his forces, caught in the hazards of war. Yet beside the formal language, a second, quieter concern was already forming among those who had seen the map, the angles, the timing. How had the opposing side appeared at exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, far beyond what their known aircraft was supposed to do? The key to that question did not lie in the wreckage or the trees. It had been set in motion days earlier in a room lit by desk lamps, where rows of clerks and analysts worked through intercepted signals that never echoed over any battlefield. Among the streams of encoded traffic moving across their desks was one message that, once carefully unraveled, no longer looked like an ordinary itinerary. It was a schedule written with almost unsettling precision: departure from Rabaul, transfer point, altitude, planned arrival near Bougainville, number and type of escorts, even the model of the transport. To those accustomed to seeing only fragments, this was something else entirely. It was as if a door had been left ajar. In that instant, the figure walking through it ceased to be untouchable and became a possible objective. Yet information alone did not make such an operation feasible. To move from theory to action, someone would have to cross that long blue distance, unseen, unannounced, and on time. Standard carrier fighters, so effective close to their ships and islands, did not have the reserves to attempt such a journey and still allow for maneuver. Heavier aircraft could travel far, but lacked the agility to slip in, act in seconds, and depart before a response formed. There was, however, one machine on the Allied side that seemed to exist exactly in the gap between those categories. Ground crews on Guadalcanal were already familiar with its unconventional outline: twin tails stretching aft like rails, a central pod for pilot and armament, broad wings carrying two powerful engines. Where typical fighters chased lightness and compact form, this design embraced range, stability, and concentrated firepower. To some, it looked odd. To the planners studying the decoded schedule, it looked like the only realistic chance. The idea that began to take shape was deceptively straightforward: launch a group of these long-range fighters from Henderson Field, send them low over the ocean along a carefully calculated route, guide them not by landmarks but by heading and time, bring them to a point near Bougainville within a margin of moments, and allow a small element to rise into the path of the Admiral's formation at exactly the instant predicted by broken code. On a blackboard, with neat chalk lines and clean arithmetic, it seemed just within reach. In the air, any misjudged heading, any unexpected wind, any careless use of the throttle would mean arriving to find empty sky, or worse, falling short of home with fuel gauges hovering near zero. Major John Mitchell, selected to lead, took the plan as a problem to be solved, not a legend in the making. With his map spread and his notes open, he worked through speeds, altitudes, consumption rates. The tolerances left no room for improvisation. This mission would demand that every pilot in the formation treat the horizon not as scenery, but as a scale against which each passing minute had to match the plan. If they were to succeed, they would have to make an opponent believe the impossible had happened, that a fighter could strike from more than 400 miles away, precisely on schedule, and vanish again into the distance. The message that changed everything did not arrive with fanfare. It slid into the workflow at a code-breaking center already buried under signals. Operators recorded, specialists grouped characters, patterns were tested against partial keys painstakingly built over prior months. What emerged, line by line, was unexpectedly precise. A senior naval commander would conduct an inspection tour of forward bases. Times, routes, altitudes, escort strength, it was all there.
No vague phrasing, no deliberate fog.
It read almost like a timetable printed for internal convenience, on the assumption that layered ciphers made it safe. The analysts understood at once that this was not just a matter of logistics. They passed the translation upward with annotations circled in pencil. Window of vulnerability, probable track, potential intercept point. In the quiet of those rooms, the realization settled that they were, in effect, holding an appointment card to a moving target that had seemed beyond reach since the war began. At higher headquarters, the implications were weighed quickly. On one side stood concerns. Was it acceptable to focus an aerial operation on a single identifiable officer? Would such a move invite similar attempts in return? Would the opposing side, seeing how exact the timing had been, deduce that its systems were compromised and cut off a valuable stream of information? On the other side stood the person at the center of that decoded schedule. This was not a routine staff visit. The individual traveling that day was the figure whose plans had reshaped the Pacific Theater, whose assessments carried enormous influence in Tokyo, whose presence among frontline sailors and aviators symbolized resolve. Removing such a leader would not end the conflict, but it would strike directly at its strategic heart. The decision, once framed that way, did not linger. Authorization was granted at the highest political level. The instruction that filtered down through commands was lean, almost understated. If it could be done without exposing the source, intercept the aircraft and ensure it did not reach its destination. Turning those words into a realistic mission fell to the airmen of the 339th Fighter Squadron at Henderson Field. When a select group of pilots assembled for a closed briefing, their first impression was the map. The point of intended contact near Bougainville sat far toward the top of the chart. The arc back to Guadalcanal stretched a long way south. Those familiar with ranges felt an immediate tightening in the room. To be there at the right time and height, they would need to cross roughly 435 miles of open ocean, maintain a course without reference points, climb into position, complete a focused engagement, and then retrace that distance. No existing single-engine fighter in local service, flown as they were used to flying them, offered the necessary endurance with any margin for maneuver. Pushing a standard design to the limit and then asking it to dogfight at the far end of its range would be an invitation to forced landings in empty sea. The briefing officers did not soften these facts. Instead, they shifted to a machine that had been operating alongside more conventional types but had not yet been used in quite this fashion. On the board appeared the outline the pilots already knew: twin booms, central nacelle, broad wings. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was introduced not as a curiosity, but as the key. 2 engines for reliability, turbo superchargers for efficient high-altitude performance, ample internal fuel, plus additional capacity in streamlined tanks bolted under the wings for ferry and long-range work. All guns placed tightly in the nose, so that when a pilot lined up his target, he did not rely on converging streams from distant wings, but on a single, focused cone of fire. For this mission, its most important asset was neither speed nor armament, but reach. Charts showed fuel consumption at specific power settings. At a controlled cruise, kept low and steady, the Lightning could theoretically cover the distance, perform a short combat, and return, arriving with a modest but real reserve instead of an empty gauge. Theory, however, allowed no waste. To turn calculation into reality, someone had to define a route that hid them from observation, minimized unnecessary climbs and turns, and delivered them to the exact point where the decoded message predicted the Admiral's transport would pass. Major John Mitchell listened, then asked for the relevant weather data and navigational information. He was known less for dramatic speeches than for calm, methodical work. The challenge appealed to precisely that part of his character. On his map, he rejected a simple straight line. A direct course would cross too close to enemy outposts and risk early detection. Instead, he traced a dogleg, first from Henderson Field toward the Russell Islands, then onto a heading that would bring them up under the plan track almost from below and behind. The logic was clear. By flying at very low altitude, they would remain hidden from most long-range observation. By offsetting their approach, they would appear at a place and angle their opponents did not expect. Yet the elegance of this design depended on unforgiving precision. At low level over uniform water, even a small compass deviation or unrecognized crosswind could nudge the formation miles away from the invisible point where two paths were supposed to intersect. With radio silence enforced to avoid giving themselves away, each pilot would be relying on Mitchell's planning and their own discipline rather than continuous verbal correction. Mitchell walked them through speeds, headings, times. Every minute had a place. Outbound cruise at economical settings. A calculated climb near the end to reach an altitude from which the attacking element could surge upward into the path of the target. A strict limit on how long they could afford to search if the other formation was not immediately visible. If they stayed too long, they would lack fuel to return. If they turned back early, the opportunity would slip through a gap that might never open again. No one in that room imagined the mission as effortless. But as the briefing concluded, a quiet understanding settled. With the Lightning's capabilities, with a decoded schedule, and with absolute adherence to the plan, this improbable intercept moved from legend into the category of things that might, just might, be done. The hours before takeoff passed in controlled routine. Ground crews moved along the pale metal skins of the aircraft, fastening drop tanks, checking lines, confirming that each Lightning carried the precise fuel load and ammunition allocation the plan allowed. Pilots walked their machines, counting on details they could see and touch to anchor them before trusting numbers scribbled on a board. Mitchell went over the route one more time, not to dramatize it, but to fix its rhythm. Lift off, settle into formation, drop to low level, hold an indicated airspeed that balanced economy and schedule, maintain heading to the first point, adjust for any observed drift, then commit to the long leg toward Bougainville.
No scenic detours.
No individual improvisations. Each element of the pattern existed to make one unlikely rendezvous feel inevitable. At Henderson Field, early sunlight stretched across the runway when the selected aircraft rolled into position. Engines started in staggered sequence, twin propeller arcs forming a steady pattern rather than a roar of chaos. Even from the cockpit, pilots could feel the difference in weight. Internal tanks full, external tanks brimming, ammunition stores untouched. These were the heaviest Lightnings many of them had ever guided down a runway. When Mitchell released brakes and pushed forward, the squadron moved as a unit. One by one, the aircraft gathered speed, lifted free, and eased into a gentle climb before the leader signaled the first descent. The land behind them began to shrink almost immediately. Their altitude dropped not for show, but for concealment. Soon the ocean filled the forward view, a textured surface close enough that each minor adjustment of pitch and bank became a deliberate act. Flying so low for so long required a different kind of concentration. At higher levels, there was room to correct a slow drift or an imprecise hand on the controls. Here, a careless moment could send a wingtip too near the water. The pilots fixed their eyes on the lead, on instruments, on the faint contrast where sky met sea ahead. They kept chatter off the air. The only voices were inside helmets, reviewing in silence the sequence to come. Mitchell's cockpit became the reference point for everyone behind. Compass, clock, airspeed indicator. He cycled through them without hurry. Tiny variations in heading translated, over this distance, into large shifts in where they would emerge. He watched for signs of wind, faint patterns on the water, small corrections needed to hold the planned course. Each observation folded back into his mental calculation, but the formation did not swing wildly. The plan allowed only subtle corrections, measured and shared. Time lengthened. With nothing on the horizon, no islands or ships to mark progress, it was easy for the mind to wander toward doubts. Were they ahead of schedule or behind? Had a current gently pushed them off the invisible line that mattered? Yet the discipline held. They trusted the interplay of training and planning that had brought them this far in other missions, now applied with unusual strictness. Fuel gauges moved with a steady inevitability. Out on the wingtips, the auxiliary tanks did their work, slowly emptying to preserve the main reserves for what lay ahead and for the way back. The quiet worry in every cockpit was the same. They needed enough to climb, to engage briefly, and then to reverse course without dipping too far into that unseen threshold beyond which there would be no home field in reach. Eventually, a faint shift appeared on the line between blue and blue. What had been an indistinct band sharpened into the outline of land. Bougainville rose ahead, dark and solid after endless water. The sight brought neither cheering nor relaxed shoulders. It brought confirmation. Mitchell compared the time with his notes. Margin, minimal, but acceptable. Climbing now would break the low, hidden profile too soon. Instead, the formation held its discrete path until the moment on the clock matched what had been drawn during the briefing. Only then did Mitchell begin a gradual rise, angling the formation into a position from which the strike element could break away. The sky remained clear of opposing aircraft. That, too, was part of the tension. If they saw nothing at all, they would have only minutes to search before simple arithmetic forced a turn for home. Mitchell gave the agreed signal. The group separated into its roles without fanfare. The larger element adjusted to form a protective band, prepared to engage any interceptors that might appear. The designated flight tasked with the primary objective turned slightly, climbing further to cut across the projected path of the inbound formation. Ahead, the air was still empty, but they were exactly where the decoded message said the Admiral's aircraft would be, at almost exactly the right moment. Another 2 or 3 minutes either way, and the entire effort would tilt toward failure. They held course, engine steady, every pilot scanning the pale horizon for the first small shapes that would decide whether this mission became one more routine patrol or an operation that would be studied long after the war. They saw them first as specks against the soft haze, moving where the plan said they would move, at the time the numbers had predicted. A compact group, 2 twin-engine transports, clean silhouettes at altitude, and a ring of single-engined escorts, their wings catching the light. The formation was right where a confident commander would expect to be safe, deep inside friendly control, following a schedule shared only through trusted channels. Mitchell's mind performed a final, silent check. Location, clock, altitude. It all converged. There was no room now for hesitation or extra circuits. Over the interphone, brief coded cues passed within elements, but the wider radio silence held. The time for careful geometry had ended. The time for a short, controlled strike had arrived. The outer group climbed, angling to place themselves between the escorts and any attempted pursuit or counterattack. The selected 4 aircraft, tasked from the start as the primary intercept element, drifted lower relative to the target's line, using speed instead of words to position themselves. Drop tanks detached cleanly, falling away and vanishing behind, weight and drag discarded in a single step. The Lightning suddenly felt more responsive, freed for the brief effort required. From his vantage point, one of the pilots in the lead element watched the nearer transport hold to its steady path, unaware that any threat had slipped through layers of assumed safety. The escort seemed relaxed, spaced for routine coverage rather than a contested approach. That illusion of security, built on range tables and encrypted confidence, was about to be challenged by a very real presence. The first closing run came in from below and behind, using the P-38's strong forward view and concentrated nose armament. There was no drawn-out maneuvering, no circling dance. The entire plan depended on speed, approach, align, fire, and brake. Traces reached out in a focused stream, not sprayed but guided, aimed at engines and vital sections that, if disrupted, would end any hope of continued flight. In the sky above Bougainville, the engagement unfolded in moments. One transport began to trail smoke and lost stability, turning toward the trees far sooner than any planned descent. The other, attempting to evade, found itself under similar pressure. The escorts, taken by surprise at the sudden appearance of opponents so far from expected bases, reacted as quickly as training allowed, turning to meet the Lightning Group and protect what remained. Here, the second portion of Mitchell's design showed its value. The covering Lightnings met the defenders with altitude and energy already in hand, forcing them to split attention, respond to the newcomers or guide the vulnerable transports. The short, intense exchange that followed scattered the formation. The targeted aircraft was no longer on its original path. The primary objective, to prevent that specific passenger from reaching his destination and continuing his tour, had been achieved in the compressed logic of aerial combat. Yet for the American pilots, there was no lingering on the scene, no time taken to circle. The mission had never been about extended pursuit or decisive air superiority over Bougainville. Every extra second spent at combat power pressed down on their fuel reserves. One Lightning failed to appear as the others formed up. The ocean would hold its own story there. For the rest, the The priority shifted instantly back to survival through planning, point toward home, return to disciplined crews, and make every remaining unit of fuel count. Mitchell gathered what remained of the formation and turned south. The exhilaration that might have followed a successful intercept stayed muted. Gauges and distances weighed heavier than emotion. Behind them, on that forested slope, the search teams would eventually find the proof. On board the Lightnings, confirmation would come only later, through intercepted messages and official notice. For now, they flew with the knowledge that they had struck exactly where the decoded message said they should, at a range that had once been dismissed as unrealistic for fighters. Again they dropped to low level over the sea, trading altitude for efficiency and concealment, slipping back into the same narrow envelope of conditions that had carried them north. Engines were pulled to planned crew settings. Hands that had tightened around control columns relaxed only slightly. Each pilot reassessed his remaining fuel, comparing reality to the figures laid out in the briefing. The return leg was a different kind of test. The complex part of the plan, the intercept, was complete, but any misjudgment now would quietly erase the day's success. If they arrived short, there would be no nearby alternative airstrips, no wide network of options. Their faith remained in Mitchell's arithmetic, in the Lightning's design, and in their own restraint. As Guadalcanal slowly rose back into view after long, careful miles, that faith proved warranted. One after another, the Lightnings approached Henderson Field with indicators edging low but still within safety. Confirmation that the fragile balance between distance, timing, and performance had held. They rolled to a stop not as figures in a story yet, but as participants in a mission whose full significance was only beginning to form. Somewhere beyond their line of sight, signals officers on both sides began to sift through the morning's events. On one side, quiet satisfaction and guarded language. On the other, a growing awareness that the loss of such a prominent commander, at such a location, raised questions not easily answered by chance encounters. Confirmation of what had happened in the air did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It came as fragments. Intercept operators noted changes in traffic patterns. Certain call signs went quiet. Formal announcements inside Japan were delayed, phrased carefully when they finally emerged. For a time, official language suggested only that an important officer's aircraft had come down while engaged in frontline duties. It was a respectful narrative, suitably dignified, and designed to emphasize dedication rather than vulnerability. But within staff circles, the location of the loss could not be ignored. Reports from the search parties described the impact site near Buin, the condition of the twin-engine transport, and the nature of the marks that traced across its surfaces. Aircrew who had flown escort that day recounted the sudden intrusion of unfamiliar fighters into what should have been a secure envelope. Those accounts, compared with maps, confronted planners with an uncomfortable equation. If the opposing aircraft had truly originated from Henderson Field or another major Allied base, they had traveled a distance previously considered beyond the practical reach of fighters, arrived at almost the exact moment of the scheduled inspection flight, and disengaged with at least some of their number making it back. To assume coincidence under those conditions strained credibility. Investigators did what investigators always do. They measured. They checked bearings from the wreckage to known bases. They mapped probable approach vectors based on witness statements and angle of damage. The numbers pointed insistently at a conclusion that had two intertwined parts. First, the adversary now possessed a type of fighter capable of operating effectively at ranges that once seemed the preserve of long-distance patrol aircraft alone. Second, the very timing of the intercept suggested that sensitive operational messages were no longer as opaque as had been believed. Neither realization was pleasant. The first undermined confidence in the protective buffer of geography. The second touched the invisible architecture of command and control, hinting that signals thought secure might in fact be offering the enemy a guidebook. To publicly acknowledge either would have been to grant the opponent psychological advantage. Internally, however, such implications had to be faced. On the Allied side, details of code-breaking success remained tightly held. The pilots who had flown the mission knew only that their information was considered reliable enough to justify a hazardous attempt. They were not briefed on the intricate structure of enemy ciphers, or the patient work that had led to this moment. What they did see and feel directly was the performance of their aircraft and the sufficiency of their preparation. For the Lightning crews, Operation Vengeance, the informal term that would attach to the mission, was a practical demonstration of what their machine could do when its strengths were exploited deliberately. The P-38 had been the subject of many opinions since its introduction. Some pilots praised its stability, its power, its ability to stay with bombers or reach distant targets. Others, coming from nimble single-engine fighters, struggled with its size and unique handling traits. Until this operation, few missions had required such a direct test of its long-range capability under strict navigational constraints. Now there was a concrete example. Two engines had provided not only speed, but a margin of reassurance over long water. The nose-mounted battery of guns had made short work of a fleeting firing opportunity, eliminating worries about convergence and spread. The generous fuel capacity, extended further by clean external tanks, had transformed a theoretical maximum range on paper into a decided advantage in practice. At the same time, the mission underscored that hardware alone was not the story. The carefully planned route, the discipline in maintaining power settings, the low-altitude approach to avoid observation, and the calm focus required to trust compass and clock over instinct, all had been essential. The lightnings were tools. It was how they were used that turned an ambitious idea into a completed sortie. Across the ocean, Japanese aviators began forming their own impressions of this twin-boom intruder. Reports described an aircraft that could appear unexpectedly far from known Allied positions, move with authority, and deliver concentrated fire from the front. It did not shed fuel or fragment under modest damage as lightly built machines sometimes did. To engage, it demanded caution and new tactics. The realization spread gradually, through experience rather than official bulletins. The loss of such a high-profile commander on a route believed to be well protected left a subtle mark on morale. It suggested that no one was entirely beyond reach, that the adversary's planning and technology had closed part of the gap that geography seemed to grant. These were intangible effects, difficult to quantify, yet they contributed to a slow shift in how airspace and distance were perceived on both sides. In the weeks that followed, Allied intelligence guarded the secret of their access to enemy communications even more closely, adjusting procedures to avoid drawing clear lines between decoded messages and visible actions. Japanese commands reviewed their signaling practices, modified certain systems, and sought reassurance that their remaining structures could be trusted. In reality, much of the underlying advantage in the Code War remained in place. Through it all, the image that persisted for many who later studied the event was simple: a group of fighters taking off from a rough island airstrip, flying hundreds of miles over empty ocean with no landmarks, rising at precisely the right point into the path of a guarded transport, and then disappearing back into the distance. It was a quiet, calculated demonstration that reach, planning, and timing could matter as much as numbers in the air. To understand why that single mission resonated so strongly, it helps to look more closely at the aircraft that made it possible. Long before it skimmed the Pacific, the P-38 had existed only as an answer to a demanding specification: a fast, high-climbing interceptor with performance far beyond existing types. Lockheed's design team, led by engineers who would later become legends in their field, chose not to stretch familiar shapes but to rethink the layout entirely. They placed the pilot and all forward armament in a central nacelle, an independent pod with clear visibility and concentrated firepower. The engines, instead of crowding the nose, moved outboard into streamlined booms, each driving its own propeller. This freed the nose from synchronization mechanisms and structural compromises, allowing all guns to point exactly where the pilot aimed, without worrying about propeller arcs or widely spaced barrels. For a brief engagement, like the one over Bougainville, that meant the first accurate burst could be decisive. Behind this shape lay a set of priorities that matched the realities of the Pacific better than anyone had predicted at the drawing board. With two liquid-cooled engines, the Lightning offered redundancy for long routes above water. A problem in one power plant did not automatically mean abandoning the aircraft. Efficient turbo superchargers allowed strong performance at higher altitudes, where many long-range bombers and reconnaissance planes operated. And crucially, the airframe size permitted generous fuel storage inside, augmented by external tanks when necessary, without pushing the design past its limits. This philosophy contrasted with opponents that had been optimized around different constraints. Japanese frontline fighters, conceived in an environment of limited industrial depth and material supply, gained impressive maneuverability and range for their weight by reducing protection and simplifying systems. In the early stages of the war, flown by highly experienced pilots, these machines had leveraged agility to dominating effect. But that approach left less room to integrate heavier protection, larger guns, or extensive self-sealing systems when the contest shifted toward endurance and survivability. The P-38 represented a different answer: accept a larger, more complex aircraft, then use industrial capacity to produce and maintain it in numbers. When such a machine was flown with discipline and backed by accurate information, as in the Yamamoto intercept, its extended reach could alter what both sides believed was possible. Pilots transitioning to the Lightning had to adjust not only to twin engines, but to a cockpit owning more instruments and systems than earlier fighters. Yet many soon appreciated its stability on long flights, the comfort of a more spacious seat, and the directness of its forward guns. Over wide ocean sectors, a platform that allowed the pilot to arrive at the fight less fatigued was not a trivial advantage. Operation Vengeance turned all these design choices into a single coherent statement. It showed that a fighter could launch from a rough island field, cross and recross a vast gap without navigational aids beyond compass and clock, engage a specific target within a short time window, and then return with just enough fuel to spare. The mission had not stretched the Lightning beyond its fundamentals. It had used those fundamentals exactly as intended. For Japanese planners reviewing their own forces, the implications extended beyond one incident. If the adversary fielded fighters with such radius and reliability, then routes once considered comfortably insulated by distance were now more exposed. Commanders and staff officers could no longer assume that appearances deep behind forward lines meant safety from focused interception. At the same time, the leadership change brought about by the loss near Bougainville carried strategic effects. Yamamoto had combined caution about national resources with a willingness to plan bold operations. His replacements inherited campaigns already strained by losses at sea and in the air, without his particular voice in internal debates. The Navy's strategic direction evolved in ways shaped more by circumstance than by cohesive long-term vision. In the background, American production lines continued to send out more aircraft like the Lightning, while training programs pushed new pilots through with increasing efficiency. The edge displayed in April 1943 was not an isolated technical marvel. It was an early glimpse of a wider pattern in which range, reliability, planning, and information would together erode the advantages that early war Japanese forces had carried. The Bougainville intercept thus stood at a crossroads, a compact event linking three currents: cryptologic insight, aeronautical design, and the gradual tilt of industrial capacity. Each of those threads would keep tightening through the remainder of the conflict, reshaping the balance of the air war across the Pacific's distances. In many later summaries, the intercept is described in clean, simple lines: codes read, fighters launched, target engaged, mission accomplished. On paper, it almost seems inevitable. In reality, its success rested on several fragile assumptions all holding at once, and that is part of why it resonated so strongly among professionals who understood how much could have gone wrong. The first assumption was informational. The decrypted schedule had to be accurate. A slight alteration of route, an unannounced change in timing, poor weather diverting the formation, or a conservative staff officer shifting plans at the last moment could have left the P-38s alone over Bougainville's coastline with nothing to show for their effort. Protecting the secrecy of code-breaking meant they could not flood the region with patrols and search radials. They had a narrow window, one shot, and then they would be compelled to pretend it had never been tailored. The second assumption was navigational. In an era before modern positioning systems, reaching a single moving point in three-dimensional space from hundreds of miles away required cooperation between planning and perception. A modest crosswind uncorrected, a slightly misread compass, or a few extra minutes spent in climb could have placed them too high, too low, or too far away to ever see the transports passing beneath scattered cloud. Mitchell's work, and the trust of his pilots in that work, carried a weight rarely acknowledged in brief headlines. The third was psychological discipline. Pilots trained in aggressive tactics had to restrain themselves for long stretches, holding back from climbing to safer altitudes or altering course in search of visible markers. They had to remain at low level, where navigation was less forgiving and any mechanical issue would leave little room for recovery, simply because the mission's logic demanded concealment above comfort. That restraint, maintained across hours, made the eventual burst of action possible. There was also the mechanical assumption. The P-38s needed to perform as advertised. Engines had to run smoothly for extended periods at carefully chosen power settings. Cooling systems had to remain stable in the dense air near the water. Fuel transfers had to occur as planned, without leaks or mismanagement. Each Lightning was a complex assembly of interdependent parts. Any serious malfunction in the wrong phase could have forced a diversion or an early turn, weakening the formation at precisely the wrong moment. That all of these elements aligned once did not imply they always would. But the fact that they did align demonstrated a growing level of integration between intelligence services, planners, engineers, and aircrews. It hinted at a maturing system in which information was not only captured but turned into precise action. For Japanese officers examining the same event from the other side, the mission offered its own stark lessons. Their security concepts had rested on several pillars: protective codes, careful scheduling, and the natural shield of distance. The Bougainville intercept indicated that 2 of those pillars had cracks. Messages could be read. Distances could be crossed. The quiet third pillar, the professionalism of their own aviators and ground crews, remained, but now had to operate with a sharper awareness that the margin for error had narrowed. Gradually, adjustments followed. Escort arrangements were reconsidered. The exposure of high-ranking visitors received more attention. Communications practices shifted toward more caution. Yet such responses required resources and time, both of which were already under strain. Production capacity had to supply multiple active fronts, and pilot training pipelines were struggling to replace losses while fuel constraints limited flight hours. Meanwhile, the P-38 continued to carve out its role as a long-range partner to bombers and a hunter able to work across broad segments of ocean. It escorted striking forces to distant islands, intercepted reconnaissance aircraft before they could complete missions, and challenged targets that had previously counted on outrunning local fighters. In these roles, its combination of speed, endurance, and concentrated fire reinforced the message that no sector could be considered entirely isolated from Allied reach. The intercept that removed Yamamoto thus functioned both as a singular episode and as a signal flare for trends already in motion. It showed that when accurate intelligence, disciplined navigation, and an airframe built for extended operations were brought together, actions that once seemed improbable could become operational tools. Those who watched closely understood that the underlying capabilities would not be confined to one iconic mission. As the conflict progressed, Japanese units found themselves increasingly confronted by opponents arriving from unexpected distances and altitudes, often with enough fuel in hand to press engagements decisively. What Operation Vengeance had illustrated on a focused scale, the ability to strike with planning rather than by chance encounter, began appearing in broader campaigns. Without speeches or slogans, an unspoken understanding took hold among many airmen. The sky was no longer divided into neat near and far zones. With aircraft like the Lightning in service, the boundary between front and rear grew less predictable. And once that idea took root, it changed the psychology of planning on both sides just as surely as any piece of hardware. One of the quieter truths revealed by the Bougainville mission was how differently each side understood the relationship between machines, people, and resources. The P-38 that traced its path over the Pacific was not an isolated marvel. It was a product of a system that could afford to be ambitious. American designers operated with an assumption rare in that era. If a concept demanded stronger alloys, more complex engines, or additional safety margins, there was a good chance industry could deliver them. That confidence encouraged risk-taking in design. Twin engines on a fighter? Accept the weight, adjust the structure. Nose-mounted armament requiring a new layout? Rework the fuselage. Turbo superchargers needing careful integration? Solve the plumbing, refine the cooling. The result was a machine with range and resilience built in, even if that meant complexity. Behind each Lightning at Henderson Field stood factories capable of turning out replacements, depots able to move spares across oceans, and training programs tailored to prepare crews for multifaceted equipment. Pilots converting to the P-38 could log substantial hours before facing combat, learning not only air combat maneuvers, but also engine management, fuel balancing, and the subtleties of long-range navigation. That investment showed on missions where endurance and system handling mattered as much as marksmanship. On the Japanese side, the equation looked different. Early in the war, their fighters and carrier groups had impressed opponents with skill and reach achieved on comparatively lean resources. But those gains reflected a design strategy that removed weight wherever possible. Minimal armor, simpler systems, and a focus on maneuver ensured impressive performance in skilled hands, yet left thinner margins for gradual adaptation. When attrition rose and replacement pilots arrived with fewer training hours, aircraft that demanded finesse but offered limited protection became less forgiving. The Yamamoto flight and its interception exposed how these philosophies played out in practice. The Admiral's escorting fighters were excellent in close combat and well handled by experienced crews. What they did not anticipate was an adversary able to appear from beyond expected radius with enough fuel and power to strike quickly and disengage. The protective bubble they imagined around their route had been drawn using assumptions that no longer held. From the perspective of American planners, Operation Vengeance became a demonstration not only of courage, but of systemic maturity. Cryptologic teams had interpreted the message. Command authority had decided swiftly. Engineers had delivered an aircraft with the necessary attributes. Mitchell and his pilots had turned abstract performance graphs into a navigated arc through real weather, real distance, and real risk. No single part could have carried the mission alone. 4 naval and air staff officers across the Pacific, this raised practical questions. If such coordination was possible once, where else might it be applied? Long-range fighters could meet bombers partway to distant targets. Reconnaissance platforms thought secure behind a curtain of distance might find adversaries waiting along their paths. Senior commanders traveling by air would need new precautions, new routes, more varied schedules, each adjustment tightening the strain on already busy units. Within Japanese headquarters, the incident encouraged careful reflection. Some argued for stronger separation between sensitive plans and general communications. Others urged more conservative travel protocols for key figures. A few pointed to the need for heavier, better protected aircraft to match growing threats. But implementing these ideas demanded metal, fuel, and time that were increasingly scarce. Meanwhile, lightnings continued to appear in places that once would have seemed unlikely. They flew escort over stretches of sea where earlier fighters would have run short. They accompanied bombers on deep strikes, not merely as token cover, but as genuine partners able to maneuver aggressively even at extended ranges. They patrolled shipping lanes and island approaches, their presence complicating enemy planning far beyond the single hillside near Buin. Those who studied the Bougainville intercept later often circled back to a simple observation. The mission showed that reach and precision could be woven together. It was not enough to fly far. One had to arrive at the right point within a narrow slice of time. It was not enough to possess strong fighters. One had to integrate them with information flows that sometimes began in silent rooms thousands of miles away. And it was not enough to have brave crews. Their actions had to fit into a pattern where every risk served a clear strategic purpose. In that sense, the neutral clearing in the jungle became a marker not just of a leader's absence, but of a turning approach to warfare. The boundary between front line and rear area, between planning table and cockpit, was growing thinner. Precision was no longer only about aim. It was about aligning design, intelligence, and execution across vast spaces without visible seams. In the months following the mission, its immediate tactical outcome quietly folded into a much larger shift. News of the admiral's loss was received in Japan with solemn ceremony. Public messaging emphasized dedication and commitment at the front. Few details were given, and those that did appear framed the event as a consequence of active engagement in contested skies. Inside operations rooms, however, the absence was deeply practical. Yamamoto had been more than a figurehead. He was a coordinator of wide-ranging plans, a voice that combined caution with boldness, and one of the few senior leaders with direct personal familiarity with the industrial capacity of his opponent. His earlier warning that a long war against such resources would be perilous had never truly left the minds of those who heard it. Now that same opponent appeared to have demonstrated, in one precise action, the very mix of reach, planning, and manufacturing strength he had cautioned against. His successor stepped into a role already constrained by reduced options. Surface forces had suffered serious setbacks. Air groups were being ground down by attrition. Each new plan had to contend with a more capable adversary who now operated with extended fighter cover and improved intelligence. Even with sincere effort, it was difficult for any replacement to recreate the mixture of authority and vision that Yamamoto had brought to earlier discussions. On the Allied side, the mission's success served several subtle purposes. For aviators in the Pacific, it was proof that the tools given to them, machines, training, information, could be combined to reach even the most protected targets. It offered a concrete story in which a difficult calculation, faithfully executed, produced results that resonated far beyond one airfield. Without needing exaggerated retelling, it demonstrated that persistence in the less visible aspects of war, decoding, logistics, testing, doctrine, could yield a moment where opportunity and capability aligned perfectly. In strategic terms, the operation strengthened an emerging pattern. Intelligence was no longer just background. It actively shaped where squadrons flew and when. Aircraft were designed and assigned not in isolation, but to fulfill specific roles made possible by that intelligence. Long-range fighters like the P-38 did not merely offer more range. They unlocked options that had previously been dismissed as impractical. Coordinated planning turned those options into real sorties rather than theoretical talking points. Among Japanese pilots and staff, accounts of the intercept circulated with varying detail. Some emphasized the sudden arrival of unfamiliar twin-boom fighters. Others focused on the precision of timing. Together, they reinforced the understanding that their opponent could now project power deeper, guided by information whose source they could not clearly identify. The psychological effect did not come from fear in a simplified sense, but from an added uncertainty. If distance and codes could no longer be relied upon as shields, then more factors had to be controlled, and with fewer resources. The intercept over Bougainville also provided a preview of how the air war would feel in its later stages. Increasingly, Japanese formations would encounter opponents who appeared seemingly ahead of schedule, already in position, armed with accurate expectations about routes and altitudes. It would become harder to imagine that any movement of significant units occurred entirely unobserved. For historians and tacticians looking back, Operation Vengeance stands out because it is neither a sprawling campaign nor a random skirmish. It is a precise line drawn between intention and outcome. A signal is read. A plan is authored. A specific capability, the P-38's long-range performance, is chosen to answer a specific need. The execution does not depend on extraordinary improvisation in the moment, but on disciplined adherence to a demanding design. What makes it compelling in narrative terms is that all of this happens at the edge of what was then considered possible. The margin for error is slim. The risks are real. Yet the mission remains within the realm of professional competence. The crews are not portrayed as mythical figures. They are trained individuals applying their skills to a well-defined challenge. The aircraft is not magic. It is a carefully engineered tool employed near its limits. And the outcome, while striking, fits the internal logic laid down the moment that decoded itinerary was placed on a desk in Pearl Harbor. In that sense, the event above Bougainville becomes less about a single individual and more about a threshold being crossed. The expectation that geography alone could secure senior leaders, the belief that technical and industrial imbalance could be offset indefinitely by courage and improvisation. These assumptions met a quiet, precise counterexample on April 18, 1943. The lesson traveled in both directions, to those who now knew what they could do, and to those who now knew what could be done to them. Years later, visitors would stand beneath the high ceiling of museums and look up at the suspended outline of the P-38, its twin booms casting long shadows under careful lighting. In photographs, the aircraft appears almost stylized, symmetrical, purposeful, unmistakable. Little plaques mention range figures, engine types, and the names of pilots who flew it, but the deeper significance of that form lies in how it was once used to redraw an invisible map. For those who flew long missions in the Pacific, the Lightning was remembered less as a collection of specifications and more as a working space. The close hum of two engines, the clear forward view, the steady feel of the controls at cruising power, the reassurance of knowing that, if one engine faltered, the other offered a path home. On missions like the Bougainville intercept, that combination of traits was not theory. It was the difference between an ambitious plan on paper and a formation of aircraft actually reaching a point that planners had marked with a circle and a time. For those in the quiet halls of signals work, Operation Vengeance remained a strict example of how success in their world should and should not be used. It showed that information, when accurate and specific, could enable actions that appeared astonishing from the outside. It also confirmed that exploiting such information came with a price. Every tailored mission risked hinting to the opponent that their messages were exposed. The care with which subsequent operations were designed bore the imprint of that awareness. For Japanese officers who examined the event in retrospect, it marked a moment when several underlying trends briefly intersected in a single line of contrail. Their own early war advantages, built on finely honed crews and agile machines, were beginning to erode under attrition and supply pressures. Their opponents were fielding sturdier aircraft with extended reach, while also improving coordination between distant headquarters and forward units. The intercept above Bougainville did not, by itself, cause those shifts, but it displayed them so clearly that they could not be ignored. In the broader arc of the conflict, the mission stood as a concentrated preview of patterns that would become increasingly common. Long-range escort fighters allowing bombers to press deeper. Targeted operations built on careful reading of communications. Coordinated timing across vast distances. None of these elements were entirely new, yet their combination at this scale in a single, focused sortie made a quiet statement about where the balance was heading. What keeps the story compelling is how little drama it needed beyond the facts themselves. There was no guarantee of success, only a set of professionals agreeing to attempt a task at the edge of their equipment's capability because the logic of the opportunity demanded it. They did not rely on spectacle. They relied on preparation, restraint, and a machine that had been built with enough margin to allow such confidence. In narrative form, it is tempting to reduce the Bougainville intercept to a symbol, one side's ingenuity challenging another side's assumptions. Yet the reality is more intricate. The mission succeeded because many incremental efforts converged, from engineers refining cooling ducts on a test stand years earlier, to cryptologic teams mapping out patterns in routine traffic, to ground crews tightening fittings on drop tanks before dawn. Each contribution, taken alone, would seem ordinary. Together, they allowed a squadron to take off from an island most people at home could not place on a map, fly out over featureless water, and arrive exactly where a decoded line of text said a particular aircraft would be. On the hillside near Buin, the search teams who first approached the scattered debris did not see all of that. They saw only the immediate result, a broken aircraft farther from safety than they believed opposing fighters could reach. Their instruments, their calculations, and their professional judgment told them they were facing an outcome that should not have been achievable under their prior estimates. That sense of encountering something just beyond expected limits is at the center of why the mission has been discussed ever since. Operation Vengeance is remembered not because it was loud, but because it was exact. It did not reshape the war in a single stroke, yet it illustrated, with unusual clarity, what happened when information superiority, industrial depth, and careful design were translated into action without excess motion. It showed that a fighter conceived to push the boundaries of speed and altitude could, when guided by a few lines of decrypted schedule and flown by crews willing to trust a demanding plan, reach far across the ocean and alter the course of another nation's command structure in a matter of minutes. For a modern audience hearing the story, the key impression is less about triumphalism and more about connection. Every element, the quiet rooms of the analysts, the drafting tables of the designers, the long hours of training, the calm voice of a mission leader in a cramped briefing hut, the concentration of pilots holding low level over an empty sea, contributes to a single coordinated moment. The mission over Bougainville makes visible how these parts fit. And for the pilots who brought their Lightnings back to Henderson Field that day, rolling to a halt with fuel gauges low but not empty, the meaning was simple and immediate. A difficult assignment had been carried out as envisioned. A formation had held together across distance and uncertainty. An aircraft that once looked unconventional parked in its revetment having done precisely what its designers had promised it could do. The officers studying wreckage in the jungle, the signalers tracing the implications of timing, the planners adjusting future routes, each group, in its own way, recognized the same underlying fact. The range line they had drawn in their minds had moved. From that point on, any calculation of what was too far for an opponent to reach would have to account for aircraft that could do what the P-38 did that morning, and for the possibility that somewhere, someone was already reading the schedule.